Assalamu alaikum and welcome to this evening's Big Question. I'm delighted to be joined by our guests this evening, Ali Gokal and Imran Shah, where we're discussing the elections. Which party has your vote? What are the differences between the parties? What are the policy implications to Muslims and indeed wider society as well? Imran Shah, any particular party that catches your attention when it comes to the Muslim vote?
I mean, essentially, what I'm seeing on social media is a number of things. One is that a lot of Muslims are going towards the Green Party and towards the sort of, especially in Scotland, the SNP. There are much more of a shift towards Labour in terms of the South, from what I see. But really, we see Muslims trying to move politics towards the left rather after a number of years of having politics towards the right. So, I mean, in terms of the Muslim
why
vote,
do you think that is? Why do you think people are going towards the Green Party?
I think mainly because of the main issues with Muslims is Islamophobia and foreign policy. Yeah, so with the Greens' policies in terms of their foreign affairs and in terms of how they want to conduct themselves in a very idealistic fashion, that attracts Muslims a lot. It's finally someone that represents their views, are just foreign policy, and that's very attractive towards Muslims who've been calling this and want this for a very long time.
Yeah, the argument is, that's a bit silly, isn't it, really, because let's face it, no one really cares about the Greens. I mean, they've been around for a jolly long time, but one MP ain't exactly going to make a huge difference if they even get there.
There is that argument, and that is a valid argument.
Better off strategically voting on a constituency level and influencing policy than voting for the Green Party. It's hardly very revolutionary, is it?
Well, yeah, exactly. I mean, there are certain seats where there is a sort of a margin between Green and another seat. There's a seat in Sheffield that is the case as well. So on a very constituency basis, there is a real chance for Muslims to try and swing the Green vote, and that can be some kind of breakthrough for the Green Party, but more so for the SNP in Scotland, because they're far more left than Labour, and that's really important as well, because the whole of Scotland, we've seen another poll today, Ipsos Mori, saying that the whole of Scotland is going to turn yellow. They're all going to get all the seats in Scotland, and you're going to have a real massive presence. So the SNP hemorrhaging of Labour is really key in this, something to really keep an eye on. But also in the marginals in the rest of England and Wales, you see a lot more of them polling towards Labour, where they used to be Lib Dem and Conservative. So there is a real sort of push, and that's partly because of the sort of policies that Labour's offering. There's a real sort of emphasis on issues of Islamophobia, particularly from teaching it in schools as they do with homosexuality and sexism and racism and whatnot, and from the counter-terrorism bill and whatnot. There's a real sort of package of ideas when it comes to dealing with Islamophobia, especially when there's a witch hunt, it seems, consecutively from the Tories and the Lib Dem coalition, as we've seen over the last 5 years.
Yeah, but Labour weren't exactly sort of innocent, were they, when it comes to Islamophobia?
No, of course, no.
We had the Iraq War, we had the Afghan War, we had Jack Straw's remarks,
we had counter-terrorism stuff.
Yeah, of course.
We had various counter-terrorism laws, and so, I mean...
No, I mean, Labour was the new Labour government was essentially the one that set up the counter-terrorism bill in the first place. But what's changed now is that you sort of see in the rhetoric of Ed Miliband, who's trying to... He never uses the word New Labour anymore. In fact, he used to use the term One Nation Labour, and it's not really used anymore, but it's a sort of, from my perspective, it's trying to push the party more towards the centre, because there was a stage where New Labour was more right than the Conservatives, and now we're starting to see really Ed Miliband. The fact that he's been interviewed by Russell Brand of all people shows that there's a real effort to try and bring the politics of the Labour Party more towards the left.
Ali, go.
Very interesting points there by Brother Imran. Look, first of all, I mean, I echo what he says in terms of Ed certainly taking the party to the left. I mean, if the spectrum still exists, he was certainly further left than his brother David, who was a strong New Labour proponent. Look, to answer your question, I'll answer it in the inverse, if I may. I've been really disappointed with the Conservative Party. The Conservative Party, who I think have a lot to say to Muslim voters on a number of issues. We were talking about economic policy. They have a lot to say to small business owners. 1/3 of small business owners in London are not Muslim. They have a lot to say about social values. You know, the family nucleus, the importance of the place of worship. You know, I think a lot of Muslims are naturally aligned to the Conservatives in that sense. But unfortunately, and I think I'm right, that as of today, David Cameron is yet to visit a mosque on his election tour. They have not been engaging on the Muslim vote. I mean, there's stuff from Linton Crosby, the Tories' chief political strategist, saying don't bother with the Muslim vote. Well, don't bother going after them. Just, on David Cameron's wife's birthday, he visited a Gurdwara. He's been interacting with the Hindu vote. Nothing on Muslims. So I've been really disappointed with the Conservatives. Lord Ashcroft in 2010, just before he resigned from the party HQ, the Tory party HQ, wrote a piece in which he said, you know, we could have made significant political hay, if we had courted the Muslim vote properly, and they haven't done so. Look, between 22 and 26 seats have a proportion of 20% or more Muslim voters. You know, there are a large proportion, I think 2.7 million Muslims in this country, 4.8% of the population, the second largest block of religious voters outside the Christians. You know, the Muslim vote could be decisive in this election if the parties went after them properly.
I suppose that's the issue, isn't it, Ali Gawker? Because what difference does it make whether it's a Muslim vote? At the end of the day, we are citizens in the UK, and therefore, Muslim or non-Muslim, there are issues which matter to us all. Are there specific issues where you believe canvassing towards the Muslim vote would somehow affect Muslims? So, for example, if the Tories were to talk about, I don't know, the NHS or school dinners or whatever it may be, the economy or you know, the health, you know, there's so many things to discuss which would be applicable whether you're a Muslim, like inheritance tax or stamp duty or whatever, whether you're Muslim or not.
I see where you're coming from. I mean, look,
so what?
The reality is Muslims are seen through a particular lens, of, I mean, we were talking about Muslims are seen through the lens of Islamophobia on a number of issues. The fact that Muslims are, I mean, there's institutional Islamophobia in the media at the moment. And you don't have to look very far to see that. So if you did talk to those issues, then yes, I think you would have a lot of significance. And I don't think we should be scared about saying that. There are issues that affect me as a Muslim, just as there are issues that affect me as a 23-year-old graduate. You know, my siblings will have different issues, and my parents will have other issues as well. But because I'm a Muslim, things affect me. I'm worried about whether my children will face the kind of, vile sectarianism that we see in France and other countries around Europe. I'm worried about that. I worry about where our countries are going, and I want to be proud of being a British Muslim. I don't have to be defensive about it. I don't have to be worried about it. I don't have to be scaremongered or stigmatised or isolated or scapegoated, whatever phrase you want to use. Yeah, absolutely. I think we're on a very thin wedge. I think it's getting much worse, and the more I see of it, the harder it is to deny.
Imran Shah?
Yeah, I mean, you sort of see the same with sort of Tariq you get from Farage. Very similar to sort of the likes of Theresa May and Michael Gove. So the sort of core cabinet that we've seen in the Tory party is very similar to sort of the rhetoric that you've had when it comes to Muslims and immigrants, in particular when it comes to UKIP. So in that respect, yeah. But also,
the Labour Party wasn't much different when in power.
Well, no, but like I'm saying, the rhetoric is very, very different with Ed Miliband, and that's the sort of hope, is that when you vote for Ed Miliband, is that you're basically looking for a brand new Labour Party, far more than what came with Tony Blair. But the issue of Muslim-specific issues is still very much the case, because you're dealing with issues of Palestine, Kashmir, which is starting to become more of a prominent issue in the UK, and also a general sort of anti-Muslim hatred and Islamophobia. Now, I mean, these are starting, and the success of these campaigns are essentially, they're starting to become more of Britain's issue, UK's issue, because nobody really wants to see the politics of the UK lurch towards the far right, as we all started to see. So the success of some degree, some advocates of the Muslim community and some sort of the likes of Owen Jones and then the success is that Islamophobia is now seen to be real, and therefore it's starting to see more of a UK problem rather than just a Muslim problem. But sure. Initially, it has to be seen as that and highlighted as that.
Let's remind our callers to call in and contribute. The number to call is 0203 411 842. Will you be voting? And if so, is a particular party that has caught your attention with regards to the so-called Muslim vote? Should we be voting at all? Would it make a difference? I mean, let's just focus on that very briefly. Do you think it makes a difference, Ali Gaukaul?
Absolutely. Look, for a number of reasons. To deal with where the question's coming from, we have an imperfect voting system. I mean, I think if we had some form of proportional representation, we wouldn't be having this discussion. So first past the post is an old-fashioned, outdated and anachronistic voting system. That being said, we have to vote. Too often politicians can write off addressing Muslim issues because we don't engage with the political process. I think between 47 and 53% of Muslims voted at the last election. Britain-wide, that was about 65%. That's not good enough. Even if you're on a safe seat, get out the vote, partly because it means that politicians can't be complacent. If they see that turnout levels are rising across all levels of the community, they can't turn around and say, well, I've got it easy, I can sit back and relax for the next 5 years in Parliament. Also because the political class doesn't represent us. There aren't enough women, there aren't enough ethnic minorities, there aren't enough young people, and that's partly because we've been taking it easy. Politicians can turn around and say, hold on, we did the best we could, we didn't hear from you guys, there's been radio silence, don't blame us, blame someone else. We have to get involved. I think it's a moral imperative that we do so, and that's got to start next Thursday.
Imran Shah?
So there's 2 points of pragmatism here. So what has MEN does, Muslim Engagement and Development, what they have done in their research is show that in terms of the target seats for Conservatives and Labour, roughly half of them, Muslims in their constituency have 100% of the swing. What that means is that by the Muslim vote alone, they can decide whether that seat is Labour or Conservative just by the Muslim vote alone. And that's significant because, one, you're dealing with a hung parliament, like they're literally neck and neck in the polls, Conservatives and Labour, so there's not going to be any sort of landslide of any sort of degree. But when you're dealing with a hung parliament, it means essentially we can affect what kind of government is going to, or what kind of politics is going to be inside Parliament. That's one thing. So the Muslim vote is very powerful in that respect. Secondly, what UKIP has done, and the reason why UKIP has risen in some sort of degree, simply because every single election, whether it's local, national, European, the vote share has been going up and up and up. And when politicians look at that, when parties look at that, they see that's where the votes are. Therefore, we must draft policies that in order to try to galvanise that vote. That's why you sort of seen the likes of the Tories, to some degree Labour, and to some degree Lib Dem moving towards trying to, as the term is, out UKIP, yeah, because essentially because that's where they see the vote share is. So if you are going to try and vote for, if you don't want to vote Labour, and this is something that maybe Green voters might want to do, is that in the next coming of years, is that essentially if we see a much more of a bigger vote towards the Greens, then the major parties will start to see, oh, this is where the votes are, and therefore they'll start creating more greener or more left-wing policies.
So it's worth noting also that, I mean, we're back to the era of 1979 British politics where James Callaghan lost a vote of no confidence by one MP. I mean, lost 311 to 310. Yeah. We're at that point where it really does matter. The fine numbers matter. So if the Tories have 280 MPs and Labour have 270, it's very close in Parliament. But look, voting is not the only way to get involved and to shape party politics. We don't have enough Muslims who are members of political parties who are standing for candidacy of political parties. I mean, I talk to politicians who tell me all the time that I don't get any letters from you guys, apart from one or two instances over the Iraq War, over Gaza, and the usual suspects. We've got to make ourselves known. As I said, 2.7 million Muslims. We should be a political force. It should be the case that, as with the Jewish community, to some extent the Sikh and Hindu community, we put our money where our mouth is, we put our votes where our mouth is. And if you isolate the Jewish community, for example, you're in trouble. David Cameron has a sit-down once a year with Jewish community leaders, closed doors, behind closed scenes. And he doesn't do that with Muslim leaders, to my knowledge. He doesn't do that with other faith groups. It's because the Jewish vote, the Jewish community matters. And if you isolate them, you might as well say adieu and goodbye to politics altogether. We can get to that point very soon.
Sure. I mean, one of the very confusing factors for many out there, I suppose, at the moment, is they're unable to distinguish and decipher between the parties. So no one's really able to say, yeah, you know what, generally most people have a sort of a tick box, and, yes, Labour will do this, and Conservatives will do that, and Lib Dems will do this, and the UKIP and SNP and all the rest of them. But at the moment, many cannot distinguish between the parties, and as a result, they just don't vote at all. Because there isn't a huge policy, difference.
Yeah.
What's your view on that, Imran Shah?
I think this election we started to see, especially with social media, there is always that sort of suspicion and that view that social media is essentially going to be the driver and the decider of the election, simply because whilst before you sort of see all the television broadcasts, you see all the press media and whatnot, and most people, especially young people, especially the ethnic minorities, don't read those papers, so that sort of perception is sort of held back then. Now with social media, it's all in front of our faces. We can sort of see all those narratives, we can see the differentiation between various issues on economy, on BME communities, on NHS and whatnot, and we can see the flurry of all that sort of facts and figures. We can start to see essentially what is the difference between different types of parties. And we can sort of also see it from the TV debates now. When you see the likes of SNP and Green basically really challenging Labour and the Tories, that sort of added diversity really sort of creates the distillation of differences within the parties. So I start, and you know, the consequence, I think, is really sort of healthy for our democracy, but also at the same time, you raised the point, is that as Muslims we need to be very sure exactly where we're getting information from. It also means that we need to be proactive. We need to be reading the right papers, or if not a diverse number of papers. We need to be very clear what kind of impact we want to have in our community, and that's with the vote as well as well as other issues.
Ali Gokul, should individuals vote on a national or local level? One of the predicaments that one often faces is, you may be a great fan of your local MP that's helped you, build your mosque, has given you planning permission, but on a national level, the party's policies are pretty atrocious. And many are just torn between this. What advice can you give in that regard?
It's difficult. I would say, given the system we have, vote on a national level. Vote on a local level. We don't have presidential politics. As close as we're getting to it by the nature of media and how I like Miliband, I like Cameron. Actually, you don't get to vote for Miliband unless you live in a particular constituency. You don't get to vote for Cameron unless you live in Oxfordshire. The reality is, vote for the local party. If you've got an MP who's a Conservative but actually is open-minded to discuss issues with you, then vote for him. If your local MP is a Labour candidate who was very, open to discussion on the Iraq War and, listened to you on tuition fees and has supported your mosque in various ways, vote for them. There is a law of unintended consequences when it comes to voting, number one. And number two, we've got to treat our vote as sacrosanct. We can't just, throw it away willy-nilly. I like this party. It doesn't work like that. Foreign policy is more shaped by having an MP in your local constituency who will go out to bat for you in the Commons on the green benches than, you throwing your vote away for someone you would like to have been Prime Minister but didn't quite make the cut. Because ultimately he won't be leader anymore, so it doesn't really matter. And there'll be a whitewash and they'll move on. Vote on a local level. Look at your constituency. Who is it that talks to your issues on a local level? And I think it bears fruit when they go and talk about your issues in Westminster.
Imran Shah?
Yeah, I mean, I would sort of agree, but we have to work on both levels. One is that essentially on a constituency level, we have to make sure that regardless of party, the good MP gets through. So there are good and bad MPs in all the parties, yeah? So we need to make sure that even if they're Tory, Labour or Lib Dem, we want to make sure that they're not Islamophobic, they're not pro-Zionist, you want to make sure that they will do what they can to challenge this sort of injustices they see on the basis that we want to do them to do so in all sort of types of injustices, no matter who they are. So the danger is that we sort of see that, well, one party did this atrocity and they're all bad and whitewash them all. But if you have a look at David Ward, who's a Lib Dem, he's so pro-Palestinian. It's amazing, the amount of times that he's been hounded by the Zionist lobby and still remained within the party is quite phenomenal in itself. And then you look at other sort of MPs like Shabana Mahmood and these sort of MPs that are good in all sorts of parties. So we want to make sure we get the right sort of MPs, the right ethical MPs in different parties. Now on the national level, we still have to look at that because especially in opportunities like the elections, we want to make sure that issues that matter to us, where manifestos are being issued, policies that really affect us or what we see to be shape a just society, we want to work on the national level to try and shape those. So the opportunities to try and shape policy is really necessary, and you need that national framework to do so.
But that's where strong leadership from the Muslim community at large comes in. I, as an individual, can't do a great deal to affect counter-terrorism policy. I can't do a great deal to affect the way whether we have a two-state solution or not. What I can do is I can get behind MEND or MCB or whichever community organisation you support. That's when on a national level I can make a difference. I can get involved and vote for the leader of the Labour Party if I'd been a Labour Party member. But on a local level, and actually part of the reason why we have such tribal party politics is because voters are lazy. And we find it easier to vote Conservative or Labour rather than voting for David or Sarah or voting for John or Jane. You know, if actually we got to know our local politicians, not only would it, make this divide, which is so sectarian as it were at the moment, less prominent, it would also mean that our MPs are actually willing to step outside the fold and engage with us a bit more, because actually they view us as being lazy and indolent, and we view them as being aloof and not engaging with us.
Sure. I mean, it's interesting you mentioned the fact of leadership within the Muslim community. I mean, Imran, how is there a lack of leadership within the Muslim community?
Yes, there is. I think that's slowly changing. But generally we've seen a good number of generations at least where there isn't that strong leadership that's able to champion the causes of the Muslims in the UK. We are starting to see that change, but it's only within the crisis and the state of emergency we have under Islamophobia. But even then, we are, we're not able to sort of meet the demands in order for us to be able to tackle Islamophobia effectively. So there is a crisis of leadership, but there's also, with that crisis of identity, how do we rectify or resolve that identity where we are Muslim and British, and still be able to talk about issues of foreign policy, issues of Islamophobia, especially when we have an establishment that's trying to really show that Muslim as a religion, as an identity, is inherently alien and inherently savage and un-British as a result.
Now, how do we have an establishment that's trying to show that?
You look at the rhetoric in terms of the Trojan horse debacle, how they highlighted Muslim schools. You look at the Charity Commission that highlighted the issues of Muslim charities on suspicion without any evidence at all. You look at the way in which certain people like Gilligan, who is actually employed by Boris, he's in churning out articles that are essentially calling organisations like sort of entryism and trying to infiltrate the British system by in the ways that other businesses and other organisations do so quite normally. So that sort of sense of suspicion and inequality is rampant, and that's something that we as a Muslim community has to acknowledge, but also rectify in a way that we are able to stake our peace in this country.
Ali Gokul?
Interesting analysis. I think Imran's largely right on that. Look, when Andrew Gilligan wrote the pieces he did for the Telegraph, the Sunday Telegraph, there was response from the Muslim community to some extent, but where was the absolute flooding of Telegraph inboxes from Mohammed and Fatima saying this is absolutely unacceptable what you're doing? Why is it that Melanie Phillips is able to get away, Katie Hopkins is able to get away with the kind of xenophobic slander that she does? Nigel Farage talks about the fifth column every available opportunity. Individuals have to do more. Look, I think Muslim leadership's improving. I think our organisations are becoming more robust and stronger. The problem is we're behind the curve. We're facing key existential crises. I saw some polls that suggest that 45% of all Muslims have faced Islamophobia to the extent where they considered whether it's possible for them to continue being British Muslims. And 37% of respondents to a BBC survey said that there were too many Muslims in this country. Those are key existential crises. We have to have big answers to those big questions, and the reality is we're behind the curve, we're behind the times, we have to get on with it.
How's Muslim leadership improving? You're both sort of rather optimistically suggested that Muslim
the fact that
leadership is improving. What improvement do you see? Most people say it's a bit of a shambles.
Well, I mean, it's improving to a very slow pace. The fact that we have 3 Muslim manifestos that are sort of singing from the similar sort of hymn sheet is indicative to the fact that that there is some kind of improvement. The fact that the Islamophobia is being prioritised by Muslim community, by Muslim organisations, is indicative of that improvement. They're finally starting to sort of see, and the sort of growing nightmare of the CTS bill of general sort of Islamophobia is starting to dawn on not just the masses, but these leaderships who were very reluctant to sort of step out of place before. So they're starting to smell the salt, as it were. They're starting to really sort of organise themselves as to what ability they're able to do so will depend on their ability to learn the sort of necessities of lobbying, the necessities of being able to craft narrative and identity, but also more vitally, how willing is the individual Muslim, the grassroots, are willing to get behind, and to what level are they willing to sacrifice in order to try and support these organisations that are trying to defend them. And that's something that we are struggling against, but there is that change. And for those people who are listening, is that if you really are concerned about not just your future, but your children's future in this country, to be healthy, strong in identity, to be Muslim, that in any sort of non-diluted form, then you really have to think about what are you willing to sacrifice in terms of finance, in terms of time, in terms of money, and what organisations you are willing to get behind in order to try and defend your future in the UK.
Ali Gokul.
Look, I think we're becoming better at reactivity. We were very quick on Charlie Hebdo. We were quite quick on, 2 or 3 other Woolwich, for example. We're not very good at the proactivity, number one. Number two, I cannot bear the fact that there are Muslim organisations out there, the biggest of all the Muslim organisations, saying things like, we can't afford to employ the staff we need to do the stuff we want to do. We have the big ideas, we just don't have people to do it. I can't stand the fact that they're going around with a begging bowl saying, please donate however much you can. They should be flooded with money. They should be, I'm not saying they should be, frivolous, but they should be, they shouldn't have to look too far to be able to get on with some of the big projects that they want to do. And that's partly our shortcomings. I want to see more interactivity. I want to see us with more, less isolationist. I want to see us interacting with the media more. I want us to be more press savvy. We're slowly getting the hang of these things, but too slow a pace. We're at a glacial pace when, as I said, things and events are happening around us that we're not keeping up with.
Are there any, obviously, as Muslims, we look at parties in many respects, and we'll look at various policies and positions that parties will take with regards to the NHS, to the economy, to schools, to all sorts of things. I mean, when it comes to the NHS, for example, is there a particular party that stands out, Imran Shah?
I mean, when you look at the track record of the last 5 years, I think it was the Mirror, the Daily Mirror, that said on 8th of February last year that Tory donors were getting contracts, NHS contracts. So you, from that record, and the Guardian said it later in that year, so from that it makes me suspect that really if the Tory government get in again, and maybe the Lib Dems have some kind of responsibility in that, but essentially if the Tory government gets in again, then to what level are Tory donors be able to have private NHS contracts to profit again? And for me, I don't, to sort of not trying. It sort of pops in my mind, but I don't trust the Tories with the NHS. I don't want to sort of.
Well, why not? I mean, the fact that your argument's a little bit frivolous, isn't it? I mean, what you're essentially saying is, because a Tory donor, let's assume it is correct. I mean, I don't know if it is or not, but let's assume a Tory donor happens to be a supplier for the NHS, who in turn profits. I mean, also what?
Well, the same.
If they're providing a good service, I mean, if I'm providing beds to the NHS and I'm making money out of it, and it is quite in the public domain, so what?
The problem is that essentially there is a slow erosion and a slow privatisation of the NHS, and that's something that's really dangerous. To what?
Why?
Because then the NHS becomes more about profit than it is about people. The same peers and the same Tory MPs that voted for the reforms are the ones that essentially have some kind of sponsorship or own these sort of private healthcare companies, and there is a direct conflict of interest in that respect.
Okay, if the viewers at home are really concerned about the NHS, all they need to do is go on the King's Fund website, which is a think tank about these issues, and go and read about the effect that some of the Tory and Lib Dem top-down reorganisation on the NHS had. The fact that, despite the fact the medical community patients, voters at large, were completely opposed to top-down reorganisation of the NHS. Getting rid of primary care trusts. The fact that GPs have more control over what it is they do in their surgeries. The fact is that it deteriorated patient care. Money was wasted. And look, Andrew Lansley, what he did wasn't driven by care of patients. It wasn't driven by the fact that we need a top-notch National Health Service. It was driven by the fact the Treasury turned to him and said, we need you to cut £5 billion. So the Tory record, I just read the story earlier today that a local hospital last month had 700 A&E patients waiting more than 4 hours because they haven't got enough beds. You read these horror stories.
I sort of read the same thing during the Labour government.
My point is...
They didn't exactly have an impeccable record when it came to the NHS.
No, I agree. I think that...
the Tories have inherited. You hear this whole inheritance argument.
Let's be fair. Okay, so what have the three main parties said in the NHS? They've all protected it. They've all ring-fenced NHS spending. We've had figures from £1 billion rising to £8 billion to £2.5 billion a year, whatever it is. It's funny because a lot of that money won't actually go into the NHS, as it were, won't pay for doctors or beds or anything. It will pay for the NHS's large and largening deficit. So, okay, fine. The parties will say what they say, as you correctly point out. What we've got to look at is the underlying ideas and who is it that wields power. Labour have said that they will introduce 8,000 doctors, 3,000 midwives, 20,000 nurses. Okay, there's been a lot of talk about mental health. I'm glad that the parties are finally wisening up to and talking about mental health, for example. But the reality is, if you're concerned about the NHS, and whichever party it is you vote for, read what the King's Trust have to say, where they talk about the importance, not just of maintaining spending in line with inflation, you need to far exceed it. The privatisation one's a misnomer to me. Look, and it's probably, it's sacrilegious to say it, but if privatisation to some extent, whether it's up to 5% as Labour say, or whatever the figure is, if it means improved healthcare, I'm willing to try it out just because of the falling standards we have at the moment, which are absolutely unacceptable in 2015 Britain. So give it a go. If it works, then great. If it doesn't work, then let's move on and really consider what we can do.
Thoughts?
Well, there is also, in terms of healthcare and NHS, the main party that's actually championing mental health is the Lib Dems. It's all over their manifesto, where it isn't any other manifesto. So it is particularly interesting that that those who, and mental health has such a bad sort of history when it comes to the UK. Like, we are so bad in dealing with mental health patients. So it's interesting that for those who are affected by mental health, a lot of us in the UK, the Lib Dems may be something that you want to look at in terms of your constituency.
All right, you've been watching The Big Question live on Ahlul Bayt TV. We are, of course, discussing the upcoming elections and what role and responsibility does the Muslim have to play. Well, in that regard, we need to go to a break for Salah. We shall be back shortly. Of course, you can join us via the phones. 02034 117 842 is the number to call. See you soon. Assalamu alaikum.